for your attendance and for your passion and interest in this, particularly on the day before Independence Day and taking the time out this evening. So my name is Tim Anderson. I'm the Vice President of the East Bay Animal PAC. I was expecting that Michael Goudreau, the President of the East Bay Animal PAC, would be doing this, but he's come down with laryngitis, so let's all feel sorry for that. But in addition to Michael and myself, the members of the East Bay Animal PAC are our Treasurer, Christine Middleton, and our Secretary and Head of Community Outreach, Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. I don't see him here, but here he is. Our IT and Communications Coordinator, Guru, Mark Middleton. So I don't see Mara Guccione here, but I think one of the Berkeley Animal Care Commissioners was planning on attending as well, so she might pop in and we can all say hi.
I'm also an Animal Care Commission member.
See you here. Sorry. Yes, so here we go. Berkeley Animal Care. You do, yes. Yes. And thank you, Michael, for helping to coordinate this shared office space for us to hold the meeting. Hampton Creek donated some food over here. I think we've got some Yoko's cheese as well, some Gaya cheesecake. So make sure you get some of that and enjoy the delicious vegan food that's been contributed to us here. Let me tell you a little bit about the East Bay Animal PAC. The East Bay Animal PAC is a voluntary organization set up to operate to support animal-friendly candidates, to promote animal-friendly legislation, and to educate candidates, board members, and commission members, and other public officials about issues related to animal welfare and really to help promote the interests of animal residents within the East Bay. In order to bring all of this to fruition and commit the kind of resources required to reorient to a world that is favorable to animals, we really need all of your support, and we need you to join us. As we approach the 2018 election cycle, we have some exciting opportunities to really help shape the political landscape for animals, but we can't really do it without your help. So definitely sign up for our mailing list, join our membership, and donate money. Any of the board members who I've introduced you to can help orient you towards how to go about doing any of that tonight. So in addition to any of our organized political activity around the campaigns, we're also focused on getting members of the community oriented to their political power within the process. So hosting events like this, where we're able to engage with elected officials around issues that we all so clearly care about, are important aspects of our work. And in that spirit, we're really proud to have as our inaugural guest speaker Alameda County District Attorney Nancy O'Malley. So let me tell you a little bit about what Nancy has done over the years. It's quite extensive. Nancy has served as the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of Alameda County since being appointed by the Alameda County Board of Supervisors in September of 2009. Subsequently, she was elected by the Alameda County voters unopposed to the position in November of 2010. Ms. O'Malley is a nationally recognized expert in issues involving violence against women, violence against persons with disabilities, and interpersonal violence, including sexual assault, domestic violence, elder abuse, child abuse, stalking, and human exploitation and trafficking. Nancy is increasingly being recognized as a leader in the animal protection movement. She recently provided her guidance, expertise, and support to establish and grow the LINK conference that brought together Alameda County leaders to discuss the interconnectivity of abuse of vulnerable family members, including non-human animals. So with additional legislative and prosecutorial accomplishments too numerous to mention, I will, without further ado, give you Nancy O'Malley.
First, let me
thank Michael and the board for inviting me. This is exciting for me to be here because, you know, there's so much interest in this. There are many of us in our communities, as you all know, who are just absolute animal lovers and animal protectors. And so, you know, oftentimes when we have cases, not my office, because we embrace our protection of animals and we incorporate them into what I would call multi-species complaints. So when you have a complaint that involves violence against a person, we are often also looking at whether or not there's violence against their pet, or there has been some kind of violence inflicted on their pet. That's what we call multi-species complaint. But you know, I remember being many years ago in Los Angeles doing a training program for their district attorney's office. And at the time, Marsha Clark was nobody. Now she became famous with the O.J. Simpson case, but she had talked about trying a case. It was a terrible domestic violence case where the family was really being terrorized by the perpetrator of domestic violence. And then he went to sleep one day and was sleeping in a chair, and the wife got a gun and killed him in his sleep. And so it was a challenge for the law because self-defense is imminent harm, and he was asleep and things like that. But what he also did as part of his torture of this family was he took the puppy, their family puppy, and put a hose in its mouth, turned on the water, and then threw the puppy on the roof. So when the police came and responded to what had happened, they saw the little puppy up on the roof. The jury was a little bit lukewarm about what happened with the wife and the abuse and the guy who got killed. They hated that. They absolutely hated what happened to the puppy. And you know, I think that what that represented to us is that we cannot overlook the fact that when people hurt species, when they hurt people, when they hurt pets, and I'm not just talking about cats and dogs, or any kind of animal that provides support or love or comfort or companionship, that it really brings out the protectiveness in many of us, and I'm thrilled about that. We also then fast forward to Michael Vick, who was involved in, you know, dog fighting, and thought that there was something culturally okay with pitting dogs against each other to the point where they were harming them so badly that they had to be euthanized, or they themselves were killing the pets. And he ended up going to prison for that. And so that's just a little bit of history of how we focused on a lot of this area about what's the involvement of pets in, or what's the involvement of cruelty to animals when people are really dangerous to others. When I was younger, the FBI did some really interesting studies that I went to a conference to see. And what they did, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the statistics that we know that should be red flags for law enforcement or other protectors of our society when they're going out to look at what the danger is a particular individual poses to others. And by others, I mean our four-legged and those with tails and human beings as well. Part of what we know is that at that time, the FBI was looking at serial killers. And what they found was a consistent demographic of these individuals. Personal demographic was that they were fire starters and they abused animals. And they didn't necessarily abuse someone's pet or their own pet, but they abused animals that were in the wild. They would catch squirrels and torture them, or they would take feral cats and torture them, things like that. Common denominator, which they started to recognize that pathology of someone who has the ability to be a serial killer or a serial offender because of their when they did this as young people, as teenagers, as young people. We know that when animal abusers are 5 times more likely to commit violent crimes, statistically, and against people, and 4 times more likely to commit crimes involving property. Many times, those individuals that we know from their demographics will really dig down, and there's looking at their personal self, and then there's looking at their history. The history rarely records the animal abuse, but yet we can see it playing out when the individuals are interviewed, and you talk to their family members and say, we don't want that person around our family pet, or you know, they killed our birds, or they killed the hamsters, or they tortured the animals. We also know that 76% of animal abusers are also abusing people in their house. That shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone because abuse is abuse. 70% of women who escape domestic violence and go to shelters have either owned or have owned a pet. And you know, oftentimes that is the difference between somebody leaving a violent relationship or staying. Because they fear, women tell us, primarily women, but certainly it happens with men too. They fear that if I leave, what is that person going to do to my pet or my companion? About 43% of school shooters, this is very interesting, 43% of those mass tragedy school shootings, those individuals displayed animal abuse before they got the final gun and went and shot up a school or killed a lot of people. So when we look at statistics like that, it should be educating us about what we should be doing, how we should be looking at young people particularly, as they're developing their personality or as they're growing up, to see is there something that is a red flag that when they're young, that's when you can intervene. By the time they get to killing, mass killings, or doing some other horrendous crimes, that at that point the intervention is very complicated. We also know that from the FBI that animal cruelty was a predictor of violence, of people who are going to be violent in a mass environment. And in the study of over 44,000 males, the sexual abuse of animals was the largest risk factor. Sexual abuse of animals was the largest risk factor and the strongest predictor of the increased risk of child abuse and child sexual abuse. 92% of our adult protective service workers report finding animals who are either neglected, that coexist in the household, or were outright abused by the offender. And then since implementing the partnership 3 years ago, in New York City, the New York Police Department and the American Society of the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals has seen triple-digit increases in crimes being charged against individuals who are involved in or committing abuse of animals. So we've been looking at this for quite some time. Just in last year alone, or in the last couple of years, we filed over 102 cases involving animal cruelty in our cases. But what we started to look at was really what is the intersect and how are we responding to the intersect between interpersonal violence and animal abuse or animal cruelty. Because even though we're very aware and focused on what's happening with our animals, there has been a disconnect between what's happening with humans and what's happening with animals. And that is what has driven us to create a task force and bring us to this point now, is to really close that gap so that it's not enough for us who understand the importance of our pets, understand the importance of their lives and the protection that we have for them, along with what's happening with human beings. So let me just tell you, of those 102 defendants that we have filed charges against, 49 of them, we only filed charges involving animal cruelty. We did not identify or find abuse of human beings either in their life or in their home. But 52% of them, it was multiple species charging. So that once again reinforces that when we see someone who's abusing other people in the family or the neighborhood, no-brainer, but it's not a no-brainer. It's all about training and reminding people and bringing awareness. But one of the questions that we're recommending be asked to someone who is in danger is, do you have a pet at home? And are you concerned about the safety of your pet? Now when you go to the doctor, generally medical people are saying, do you feel safe in your home? And that's how that question gets to issues around family violence. But we wanted to add the issue around animals because we know, again, that if the pet's not safe, that it's more likely than not that the family's not safe. So what we did was I had a meeting with a vet, Dr. Jennifer Wolf, and two other individuals who came from animal shelters, one from Berkeley, one from Stanley Andrew, I believe. And we met to say, what can we do to bring awareness? How can we bring our community together to address this issue? Not just to educate people, though that's incredibly important, but also to go into someone's to get a warrant. And if they don't have anything to articulate in order to get the warrant, other than a gut feeling, that's not going to get them a warrant. Animal control officers, on the other hand, have the right to go into people's backyards and look in cars and look in windows to see if there's something going on. They can even go into a house. And so the link between animal control and law enforcement is really a critical link to be able to get access to places where these crimes are happening behind closed doors, where only someone who gets in there, or if it becomes more public, would ever know what's going on in that home. So with working with Dr. Wolf and the animal shelters, we decided that we wanted to form a task force. So we now have about 45 organizations that are part of our task force. This is a countywide task force. We've met 8 times already, and then as Tim was saying, we hosted a conference last Monday that had over 90 professionals there. We had the CHP there, the Highway Patrol there, which is fantastic. And you know, like, wow, thank you, and you're welcome for being here, please come. Because a lot of times they're stopping cars where things are happening in the car, and they're able to see it. And if they don't have a trained eye, or no one has ever given them some awareness about what happens between animals being treated badly and people being treated badly, and the intersect. We had, of course, the animal control and animal shelter people, we had law enforcement, we had prosecutors, we had a lot of different organizations that could and do oftentimes intersect. We had people from the healthcare, emergency room physicians and healthcare providers so they could start learning to ask questions about what's happening in the home, and particularly around the issues in the intersect between animal cruelty and abusing individuals. One of the people that we didn't have there, which we have a list of all the people that should have been there, and one of them is behavioral health. And this is not a criticism. We have more to do, because we know that the field of people who understand why we're doing this and understand why it's important is very large. And you know, when we have an animal cruelty case, it used to be fax machines, and now it's emails, are flooded with people from all over the country telling us what we should do with that case and that particular abuser. But one of the things that what we realize is that we need to make sure that behavioral health is there, because there are people who have mental health issues that are mentally ill, who are animal hoarders. And you know, maybe you know this, but it makes sense too that if somebody's mental illness is not dealt with, and they're hoarding cats, or they're hoarding dogs, or they're hoarding birds, or they're hoarding some other kind of animal, if you just take those animals away, it won't be long before they've gone out and found more. And it's very sad going into a place where somebody's been hoarding with animals that have died, or animals that are sick, or it's not good. So a lot of what we do with someone like that is to identify their mental health issues, and then to provide intervention. Put them on probation, or at least hold them in our vision, so that we can make sure that they're getting treatment, so that if they ultimately have a pet, which is generally not good, or invite them to go work as volunteer at an animal shelter, so they get that sensation, or they get that need filled with the animal, but they themselves are not responsible. But we've had one woman who we've been working with for a number of years, and literally every time she's doing well, she's taking medication, she doesn't have any pets in her house, and then we step away, and then we go back and check a month later, and all of a sudden we start seeing hoarding again. This is a serious mental health issue, and it doesn't help us to just take the animals away, prosecute someone like that, put them in jail. That doesn't do anything. Really, we need to deal with her mental health, because eventually, no matter what you do, eventually she's going to be back, or he is going to be back on their own. So we didn't have behavioral health, and we will the next time we meet. The other one is the county has an emergency plan, what to do in the case of a disaster, like when we had the fire or an earthquake or something. And in that emergency plan, social services is the person who has, or agency that has responsible for caring for the pets of people who are displaced. And so we need social services at the table to be there And some people say, why? I don't, what would the social service have to do with this? And they probably are asking the same question. But the truth is they have responsibility and authority around housing. And so when people get dislocated from their home, that they won't leave without their pet. If they have a dog or a cat or a horse or a cow, or they're taking those animals with them, or they're not leaving. So, you know, we've seen pictures of flood zones where people are on the roof with their horses or their animals, and, you know, or they're swimming downstream with their horse in tow. People won't leave their four-legged loved ones. And so we have to figure out what's the action plan in the event of an emergency. So people will be safe, and so will their pet or their horses or cows or whatever they have. And that's a critical component, in our opinion, for enhancing public safety, and also to make sure that people get to where they need to be safe. Another group of people that we think that haven't been there are city attorneys, because city attorneys have civil authority within their own jurisdiction. And sometimes there may not give rise to somebody who has committed a crime or that we want to prosecute, but there's still some civil liability or some civil injunctions that we can put in place that can give more control. We'll call it a velvet hammer. So we don't want to hurt people because their need to be close to the animal is real, but at the same time we can't expose animals or them to such unsafe environments and unsafe conditions. So sometimes an injunction can work where we are able to use our authority to help somebody stay focused and deal with their issues around wanting to have any pet nearby. We need the pediatricians. So one of the things that we're seeing now is that, and one of our doctors who runs the Center for Child Protection was present. He's married to a vet, so he has an interesting insight already about what to do with pets and how we can treat pets. But he was present with us because critically important to an interview for children who report or disclose being abused is, what do you have a pet in your house? And what happens with your pet? And sometimes they're hamsters. We're seeing more about hamsters and pets that are rats, pets that are in cages in the kid's room. And that is oftentimes used to get someone into compliance or further torture or psychological abuse in addition to the physical abuse. And a child who witnesses that without intervention, so we can treat what's happening to them physically or mentally about being abused by the person that they trust, or abused by someone who is supposed to take care of them. But if we don't deal with the other part of it, then we fear that kid will grow up to think that hurting pets is okay, or if you're frustrated and you don't know how to process your anger, then hurting a pet is a way to do it. And so they're all so interconnected that we just need to make sure that everybody is working on the same page. So what came out of our conference, the link? Well, we heard from it. We brought an expert out, one of our partners did. And what we've done is we've broken into working groups because we have some goals. We need to have protocols. We need to have universal training for anyone who has any authority in a position of responsibility to be looking more broadly than they are now. What does the EMT need to know when he or she goes into a home where somebody is called for ambulance service? What does the animal control officer need to know when they go in and see something that's bad, and they know to call the police, but are they really looking for where are the children in the house? Where's the parent in the house? What do the police need to know when they go in on a claim of child abuse and there are pets there, and pets that are limping, or pets that have been, we believe, could be hurt, and we assume that statistically are being hurt. We have a group that has protocols for what happens when women or some men go to shelters because they've been a victim of domestic violence, because there are no shelters, no DV shelters that will allow you to bring your pet with you. So again, this is a reason why some people stay in these unhealthy, unsafe, destructive relationship, is because I'm not leaving my dog or I'm not leaving my cats. Where do they go? Building our protocols will build a network of people who will be emergency foster parents, similar to what we do with kids, but we're doing it with pets. so they can foster a cat, or they, you know, there's a lot of ranch land around here, so when people have horses or cows or other type of animals, they can go be boarded there until we figure out what to do. And the rules with the shelters is that after 14 days, if someone doesn't pay, if the animal's taken away, someone doesn't pay, then the animal gets relinquished and it can be adopted out. But sadly, too many of them end up being euthanized, and that's what we're trying to prevent. Is if we can, that is painful for the family that left their pet, and it's painful for all of us that care about animals to make sure that we're not having to euthanize because there's not enough cage space. We also don't want animals growing up in cages. We don't want them living there for a long time. That itself is cruel. Our protocol includes having people who will come, particularly for cats, and sometimes they're capturing feral cats, neutering them, and then we have a whole network of people who have barns and horses. And feral cats make great barn cats. They keep the rodent population down, they're happy, they get to be wild, but they're safe and they're taken care of. And so building all of these resources and all of these linkages, hence the link, is really important for us. We also are setting up another training that will happen in August. I think it's August 23rd. And at that training, we're going to start looking at the protocols that we've created to get input from people who might be called upon to respond or have an opinion about what our best way of dealing with a certain situation is. Building that resource list so that if I'm a police officer and I realize that there's a cat that's being hurt, that I'm not going to necessarily catch the cat or try to catch the cat because I'm not trained to do it, but who am I supposed to call and have that ready-made so we don't find out sometime later. The last thing I'll talk about, and then I'm happy to answer questions or have a conversation than just me talking, but the last thing is that it's incredibly apparent to us the role that animals can play when we have victims of crime, and particularly when someone has to come into a courtroom to talk about things that happen to them. We have two of our, we call them our deputy dogs, who are deputy dog DAs. One is named Bart, and he works in our juvenile division. He works in the mental health court, and a lot of those kids come in and they're really suffering from severe mental health issues, even at their young age. And they'll come in and just go right to the ground, and they'll just lay across Bart and talk to the judge or talk to whomever they need to talk to while they're petting Bart and being comforted by Bart. We had one situation where it was a young man who was being bullied, and every day they were robbing him and terrorizing him, and so he had to come forward and talk about what happened. And in the course of talking about what happened to him, he started to cry, and Bart stood up and put his paws on the young man's legs, as he's trained to do. Well, he just knows how to do it. And he put his face, Bart put his face against the young man's face, and just kind of moved his face like this, which took away the tears. And so, of course, that helped that young man to get through the process that he had to get through. So that's Bart, and we love him. There's a list about a mile long of who gets to run Bart at lunchtime and who gets to walk Bart. And, what we say is that Bart has really opened our eyes up to a much broader way to comfort people. And then the other one we have, our newest one, is Phoebe. She came to us as Princess, but no one's going to call her Princess, so she's Princess Phoebe. And Phoebe is working with child victims of sexual assault, who again have to come to court. And you just can't imagine, or maybe you can, that when someone's sitting on the witness stand, sometimes you feel like you're in a fishbowl. It's scary. You're talking in front of people. You're telling really private stuff that happened. And to be able to just be petting a dog or petting Phoebe or Bart when that's happening can really help them process through that pain or through that the emotions that they're going through. And so we have a woman who she had her dogs at the ghost ship fire, and her dog was one of the dogs that comforted the first responders through the ghost ship fire and the things that they were seeing. And so now she's coming to work with us too, and bringing her dog to work on call, if you will, when we have somebody who it would be beneficial for them to have our deputy dogs present to help them get through this process. So we're really thrilled about that, and we're really encouraging our colleagues around the state to understand why this is important and to embrace this in their own offices to just help people be able to get through the process that they're going through. So we're thrilled that you're all here, that there's attention on this and that there's an interest in it. We're thrilled that we have the ability to, I'll tell you, my budget presentation last week, I had a picture of Bart, and Bart knows how to give the high five. So it was a picture of that. Now, they might not have thought about, whoa, she's asking for this or she wants that. But here's Bart giving the high five. How can you not love Bart? So anyway, that's a lot what we're doing, and I hope we're going to continue to expand our work and our working groups and continue to build those networks and close those gaps so that when we do have multi-species abuse or abuse of either species, that we're able to respond appropriately and stop the harm.
Thank you.
So.
What are some challenges that you face as a district attorney in prosecuting animal abuse cases? What are some things where you'd like to take action, but maybe you're not able to for whatever reason?
Well, sometimes, like in dog fighting, it's hard to pin down who's the originator of the fighting, like who set it in motion. And so while there may be people around, some people just show up, and some people are actually, they own the dogs, but nobody will claim ownership of the dogs. So that makes it difficult about who do you prosecute, who can you hold responsible for this. And, you know, this is a place where we turn to our vet partners, because dogs get shots and they get taken care of, and if we can just figure out where they're being treated when they're injured, especially for people that are putting their dogs in fights like that, they're going to have injuries. And some of it is, you know, we have cockfights too, and so, you know, it's hard to figure out who's responsible for all of that, who's just there betting, which is illegal, but it's not the crime that we're really focusing on. So that's part of it. When we're able to put cases in front of a jury, generally speaking, the jury's going to convict, because we're going to have the evidence in front to bring against the person who's responsible for the abuse. And jurors, a lot of times jurors have such a reaction when they're being interviewed to be on the jury to say, no, I can't be fair. If that guy did that to that animal, no, I can't be fair. So finding a jury is sometimes tough to do. And then the other issue is when you have someone who's clearly mentally ill, but they cannot deal with just taking either responsibility or agreeing to what we want to do, what we know we have to do, then sometimes we have to get in front of a jury just to be able to have some authority over that person so that we can provide that intervention that they desperately need. Yes?
So I'm wondering, on the subject of the animals who are who go with the domestic abuse victims and the victims who go to shelter, are you partnering, or is there grant money available or anything like that to partner with animal rescue foundations? Because it feels like that the animal shelter probably can't deal with the problem themselves, and we have a number of not only dog and cat but also farm sanctuaries in the Bay Area.
Well, that's one of the, it's a good point that you're raising, because the shelter's not necessarily going to be where the people go. And so part of it is linking those shelters, and that goes into that resource guide that we need to be ready-made, so someone knows, okay, I've got the ambulance or somebody's going to take, the advocate's going to take mom and her kids to a shelter. I need to call to have somebody come, either animal control or someone come and take them to a foster home, because we do have a lot of people who are willing to foster, not long-term, but foster for 48 hours till we figure out where they can go, where's a safe place for them to go. And that's part of the protocol about what's the response. Where are we going to create shelters that don't now exist, and shelters that are safe and healthy, like, you know, yeah.
So is that resource list sort of a work in progress, or?
It is. So we've got one that's starting, and it's based on what we all know, our collective knowledge. But now the research is being done to dig deeper into, so if anybody knows of anything, we're all ears, because we know what we know so far. But now we've got an intern who's just digging about working with the shelters, working with vets to find out what they do to, if a dog is really abused and needs to go someplace, and so we can just make an extensive, and it's not just, like for instance, there may be places out in the valley that is not as accessible to someone who's in North County, where we're gonna have somebody drive from Oakland out to Livermore. I don't know, maybe. But that's one of the issues we're trying to find geographic. We have a partnership also with our partners in Santa Clara and Contra Costa, because it may very well be that there are shelters that we can share space when need be. Part of the challenge is that a lot of the shelters are overcrowded, and so it's really hard to find a place. That's why we're focusing more on fosters and homes that can take a pet for even a short period of time till we stabilize a family. We have the ability for domestic violence to relocate people. We can pay their rent, we can move them, we have the resources to do that. And so what we also help is finding places that are appropriate and also pet friendly, so that a family can move to a place, we can pay for it, and then get them set up in a new environment where they can bring their pet with them. So the fostering might be just really short term.
I had another question. In the animal cases, is there a split between neglect versus an intentional harm? So for example, is it mostly hoarding cases you see with just some examples of extreme, cruelty, or how do the cases break down in terms of your animal abuse?
It's a great question. Where it breaks down, what we've seen so far are animal cruelty cases, and some hoarder neglect cases. We're working with Adult Protective Services, who also are on our list of who needs to be here, because adult protective workers, and I have a team of victim advocates who work with just seniors and dependent adults, and oftentimes their companionship is their pet. And so when they are neglected, self-neglect, or families neglecting them, that's where we also see where their pet is neglected. So it's retraining and retooling. Not enough to take that senior someplace, but we have to. The seniors oftentimes won't leave without their pet, and so we don't see that much, but it's something that we know is going on. We know that seniors are being neglected at an unreasonably high rate, and we know that for a lot of seniors, that's their companionship, is their pet. So.
I have another question. Well, like I read in the news, about some guy in San Leandro that was arrested for badly beating a husky in the middle of the street or something. And I'm curious, how do you feel, or do we have adequate punishments in place? Is this, when I read it, I rarely hear about what happens to the guy. Does he get out on probation? Does he get 5 years in prison? Is it really 5 years in prison? Can you talk about that?
Sure.
When you just have people that are evil and not going to change, and they're probably going to do it again if they get the changes.
Yeah, so there's a couple things. One is it can be either a misdemeanor or a felony, depending on the gravity of the abuse. And if it's a misdemeanor, then they may not even get jail time. They may get some minimal amount of time. But the court and a condition of their being on probation is they have to go to counseling, or they have to get psychological help. And we can monitor that. That's up to the judge, whether or not they'll say, come back every month and show me that you're really going to treatment. What we say is, come back with a letter from your treatment provider who says you are really engaging. So it's not enough to go sit in a chair. We want you to be engaging in this. The more severe cases people will be convicted of felony level crime, which means they can go not to prison anymore, to state prison, but they go to local prison, which is out at our county jail, and they can do a term in local prison. I think the maximum is 3 years that they could do with good time. That's probably a year and a half. But once again, when they come out, we want people to be on probation because, one, you can hang time over their head if they don't do what they're supposed to. Two, if there's a way to intervene to stop that, to curb their behavior, then we want to get every chance to do it. And then always a prohibition. You cannot be around pets. You cannot own pets. You can't do anything with any animals. And that's pretty much the way, as much as we can do for life. Sometimes the judges can, and we ask for 10-year restraining orders away from our 10-year protective orders. That we do that with children, for people that are coming out of incarceration who have gone in because they molested kids or they physically abused kids. So we're asking for the same thing for animals that are abused. And then again, when I think about it, like that guy, the San Leandro guy, someone like that is not only beating their dog, but that's a place where we need the police and the animal control to go in the house. Say, if you're that cruel and you're that warped that you're going to beat your dog like that in front of people without a care, like it's not that big of a deal, then what's happening in your home? And we need people to get in that home and take a look and see what's happening with the family or the kids or the girlfriend or whomever it is.
Do we need, as a community, or do we need to lobby our legislators to enact tougher sentencing, or what's your wish list? What should we do at the legislative level that you would be really happy about, or what
Yeah,
you think we might need?
We're looking at that now. It's not, a lot of what we're doing in criminal justice reform is trying to identify the root cause and then treat that. Because eventually people are going to be back in our community. So we want, to the extent that we can, we want to figure out what is behind this and do something about it. So I think that if we had legislation that required, if it's animal cruelty, required mandatory assessments and progress reports and the ability of the police or animal control to go check in to make sure there's no evidence of pet ownership or involvement. Some of those right now permissive conditions of being on probation or permissive conditions of being on parole, that would be great to have that be mandatory. And if we're able to do that, then we don't have to argue about whether or not someone's going to agree to it. This is what it is. You're convicted. This is what goes along with it. What I would like to see, and what we have a focus on, and this is not necessarily legislative, but in the behavioral health world, there's not as much knowledge or attention on what is driving someone. We know what happens after we've identified as someone who's abusing animals, that person is more likely to abuse people, maybe go on to be serial killers, maybe go on to be mass shooters. That we know, but we shouldn't be waiting until somebody actually manifests that behavior. We want that's the other group that didn't come, but it was a school day, but now it's holiday, now it's the summer. Teachers, they need to know that if I'm looking at this kid who's now starting to act out and demonstrate some signs that there's something going on, either they're being abused in their home, maybe, or they're starting to abuse animals, and not just dog, cat. Again, we have pocket pets, and we have birds, and we have other types of animals. That it would be great if the behavioral health, the mental health professionals actually had some good screening tools to say, how do I catch this early? And then once I understand it, once I recognize it, what kind of intervention is going to help? What can I do to curb that behavior? We have a lot of protocols in place, behavioral modification pre-treatment program, but we really don't have one for this particular area, and that would be a place where I would like to see some investment from the behavioral health perspective. Yes.
Can anything be done to help the animals raised for food at a local level?
Animals that are being raised for food. It's an interesting, I don't know, but I'm going to make a note. I'm going to find out. That's something that might be something that can be driven by creating some legislation.
Well, related to that, I think about when you talk about prevention, I mean, there's so many industries where animal abuse is part and parcel of their work. I mean, including shelter workers who euthanize. I mean, that the trauma of just having to do that. obviously slaughterhouse workers, people who work in laboratories, and the desensitization that happens from that. So I think that's a really untapped area in terms of what are those flags and what are the precautionary measures that could be taken if those industries, I mean, I don't know how much data, I don't think there's a lot of data on what that does to a human being and what that means when they get home.
So, if I understand what you're talking about, which I agree with if I'm hearing you right, the person who works in the lab where they're, like when they used to do experiments on greyhounds, and the person who is doing those experiments, like what does that do to his or her psyche when they come home and they've spent the day breaking legs of greyhounds or something?
Yeah.
It's a very good question. And I think that kind of information is a good, strong perspective in terms of supporting the efforts to curb the use of animals to figure out if their makeup is the right shade or if the consistency is correct or, you know, all of the things. And I think it's very unpopular for industry now to test on animals. You see a lot of that. We didn't test on animals. The FDA should be going in there and checking to see if they really are not testing on animals. And if they aren't, then that's an administrative action. But as you, I mean, this is why I love talking to groups about this, because what I'm thinking is that there are some tools that we have, like my office has, to address things like unfair business practices. And if somebody is using that kind of technique that gives them an unfair advantage, or they're violating the rules or the administrative laws around use of animals in testing for product, then that's a place where my office can step in once we know. And oftentimes the way we find out about this is there's a whistleblower who's telling us what's really happening. And you know, it doesn't take much for the activists to show up outside the building, and that oftentimes leads to our ability to use the market, the free market, to pressure them not to do something. But I do think that the information, if we're able to identify it in the perspective, I hadn't really thought about it, it's a good point about what's the impact on the humans that are engaged in that too, that aren't cruel and horrible people. That could be the basis to have our legislature take some more aggressive actions, especially in business and profession code and things like that, not just a criminal perspective.
Yeah, and I'll share, I know there's a couple studies that have been done by PhD students. I mean, there's not a lot, but I mean, literally around towns where there are slaughterhouses and the workers who work in those slaughterhouses and the amount of domestic abuse that takes place and violence and et cetera. So I'll share with you what I have about that, because I mean, talk about preventative, potential preventative measures.
That would be great.
I'm curious when you talk about kind of getting at the root cause and looking at prevention, if you're thinking there's kind of thoughts not just on the behavioral health side, but the exposure to animals, and you know, even things like, you know, teaching in the schools, how do you interact in a safe way with dogs, and having animals, you know, actual encounters between you know, children, so you can build kind of healthy relationships and healthy thoughts about the animal-human interactions.
That is also a great point. So part of what with our dogs, our deputy dog brigade, that has taught us about how we can expand the tools in our toolkit to help people get through process through situations. But you know, there's a lot of information out there that we are learning from, like kids who have autism and how they are able to interact and interface with pets, either dogs or cats or birds or rabbits or other types of animals. And just we can see that where somebody whose world looked like it was closed and this big opens up. We know that with the impact that horses have on kids with physical disabilities, and what that relationship with a horse, of all things, and horseback riding and learning how to interact with animals that are huge and scary if you're a person who doesn't have the use of your legs and you're on a, you know, whatever the horse weighs. And so we learn from that. We also know that when we've used pets or animals to go into the jails, you know, in the old days out at Santa Rita, they had a whole working farm. And people, one, it kept them busy, but two, they bonded with with their pigs. It was a pig farm, and they had horses, and they had cows, and they had cats, and they had everything. And there's a real interesting whole body of research around somebody who's incarcerated, or somebody who has committed crimes to the point where they end up incarcerated, and what it is for them to care for that cat or to care for a dog. So one of the ideas that has been floated is that, we have a lot of dogs and cats and other animals in shelters, and we have people who are in jail and people who are in prison, that not as many as we used to, but there are still some. And what would that look like if we brought animals in and everyone had to take care of an animal that was trustworthy? Not somebody who couldn't, but people that aren't, who aren't predisposed to hurt an animal or be cruel to an animal, is more likely somebody who's going to bond with an animal. And so is that someplace where we can get them out of the cages and get them out of shelters and have them living with someone? There's just so much that we do now around rehabilitation and re-entry. Is this a way that we can save the animal that's on the path for euthanization, and at the same time help somebody realize what it is to have human or having species interaction, and what that looks like of having empathy and having to take care of someone and make sure that they're safe, and all of those things that many people don't have as they're growing up.
Sounds like a great idea.
Yes. So piggybacking on Colleen's question a little bit, what kind of jurisdiction do you have over people who are doing business in Alameda County, but not necessarily, like their plant isn't here or whatever, if they are abusing animals in a way that they shouldn't be? So can you, I don't know, taking the makeup example, if somebody's, abusing animals unfairly and they're in Los Angeles, but they have a store here or they're selling something here, do you have jurisdiction to then jump into that?
There's a couple of, under certain circumstances, so I think this goes to the question about animals that are being raised for food. So I'll just give you one example where we have asserted jurisdiction. It was a company in Los Angeles that was, it was an admirable company that hired adults with cognitive disability like autism or other cognitive disabilities, and they were making poop bags, packaging poop bags. So my career became reduced to poop bags for a while. And so on the poop bag packaging, there was a label that said biodegradable, which of course it's not, because we don't want animal feces in our compost piles. That is a strict liability crime. So even though they were made in Los Angeles by people with a big heart wanting to empower and give independent living to other people who might not have it, it's still false advertising. And it's also an environmental issue of having people think that they can put the poop bag with the stuff in it in the compost pile. So our effort was to address the local store owner who was selling these poop bags that were made down in LA. So that's an example where they weren't made here, but they were being sold here. So that's the doing business in Alameda County. And we were able to resolve it because we didn't want to hammer them. There was, but it's what we call strict liability. If you sell it and it's falsely advertising, then it's against the law, and we deal with it. But we were able to resolve we resolved it very nicely, in my opinion. And so there aren't poop bags being put in the compost pile or in our, they're out in the landfill somewhere.
So that could be, that could apply to something like cage-free eggs when they've got all the hens in battery cages, or still false advertising?
The problem with that is that the FDA controls the regulations about how you are able to produce eggs and how chickens, you can't, those that love animals can't even look at how they deal with animals that are producing. So part of this is putting the pressure on the FDA, and we've done that in some areas, not so much on the way animals are used and with a product that is produced from an abused animal or an animal being treated cruelly, but so it's kind of going to the FDA and making sure that they take a harder stance on animal cruelty and just how animals are treated.
Yeah, so I was just going to follow up on that question and the point about the FDA. Because it's my impression that with Proposition 2, the ban on battery cages, that the statute can be enforced by local district attorneys because the statute actually says that it is a crime for stores to sell eggs in violation of the law. And I actually worked on media around an investigation into a farm that sells in a number of stores in this county that is in violation of the law.
Really?
And, yeah, I could give you more information about that. We contacted a number of attorneys around the state of California and found that basically no city or district attorney had taken action under the law, and it's sort of been waited. There is now a prosecution by the Humane Society. The Humane Society sort of worked with an attorney to have a prosecution, but they've been very, very rare, and it's actually criminal for stores to be selling these eggs.
So you'll give me information.
Yeah, I'd be happy
Thank
to
you.
put your information.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Have you been involved at all with the live animal markets that are not far from here in Oakland, Chinatown?
Yeah, well, we haven't, I can't get into too much around
Yeah.
that. So, there's a great awareness of what's happening. That's as much as I can say.
Okay.
Yes.
I don't know if this is related, but how much do you see in terms of exotic animals, people keeping the exotic animals, and how that relates to sort of other human-related crime?
Yeah, some of that is more smuggling. We see it more in terms of smuggling, like finding the exotic animals being brought here. But again, this is a place where we only know what we know, so many of these animals are kept in cages in someone's house, and we can't just go in. So we rely on people to tell us, or we rely on the animal control if they ever get called to a house, or somebody. And this is why this whole linkage is so critically important, because people do go in the house. I mean, the guy who's fixing your PG&E, and the people that are making sure your water's running, or plumbers, or carpenters, people see things, and they might go home and say, geez, you should have seen what I saw today. We want them to tell us too, so then we can take some action about it. But the place where we've seen most is right at the point of smuggling them from wherever they're being brought from. Yes.
I'm just curious from what you just said, is there some sort of hotline or some place where people can go to say what they saw, the PG&E guy or something that's going on in their neighbor regarding animal abuse?
Well, it's an interesting thing because the animal shelters and animal control is supposed to have a hotline. We've talked about it a little bit before, whether or not there's someone actually answering the hotline. Some of it is, and it's not a criticism because resources are scarce everywhere. And even though the economy feels like it's booming, when you talk about government, they're always a couple of years behind in terms of recovery. But if there's the emergency number that gets directed to somewhere else, then like the person who's on the on-call, here's where we're looking at tapping into, however. So our Bay Area Women Against Rape, all of our shelters, our DV shelters, domestic violence shelters, all have 24/7 hotlines. And so the hotline, if it's, we're looking at whether or not that's an avenue to tap into these 800 numbers that already exist, and then they have the tree about where to go. The other resource here in the county is 211, and that's where we're looking from the resource guide, like what are they saying? What are they telling people? 211 is, you can call and say, I need a place to stay, I need, a place to change have my oil in my car changed. I mean, they're a comprehensive resource. And they keep it up to date as much as they can on an annual basis. So we're looking at 211 to see if this is a place that can link into that hotline to say, here's what I have. But on the other side of it needs to be somebody who's going to respond or is going to take that note. We have hotlines for various things, and then we check them every morning and every couple times during the day. And people leave numbers on our hotline. Like we have a hate crime, hate speech hotline. And people call there and say, I saw this guy hitting his dog, or somebody pushed the dog out on the freeway, or, things like that. And so we get a lot of calls on that hotline. So that's really one of the things we're trying to figure out is what's the best mechanism for that? And then who's on the other side? Whose job is it to respond on the other side, especially if it's critical? If it's critical, the police or animal control, we can usually activate them. If it's information, like you should go look at this house because I saw them with a gecko or something that they're not supposed to have, then we can go the next day.
So there is then, is there a place for us to go as community members for the organizations who are involved in this particular coalition, or is that public?
The coalition is for sure public.
That's okay.
Right, so we have, we're building the section on our website and on all of their websites about we want people to come to the meetings. It's not exclusive. I mean, it's not exclusive. We want anyone who's interested in this issue to come. People that can want to become volunteers, people that want to know more about it, people that have good ideas, like even tonight when I've got my notes now of things to do or places to look at some of these. That's what these are forums. They're completely established to create a forum for dialogue and for people to come in and share their information or get answers or do something like that. So we'll publish, I think, let me just tell you when the next meeting is, although we will publish it so you don't have to remember. Let's see, on August 23rd, and we meet in the conference room at the SPCA in Oakland. That's over on Baldwin. And they're very accommodating. They actually have, really clever, they have maybe other shelters have this, but this is the only one I've heard of. They have a summer camp, so people pay to send their kid to summer camp to work at the SPCA in Oakland. And I said, wow, this is I didn't know that people are paying to send their kids there, but I saw these kids with their shirts on and they're walking the dogs and they're petting the cats and they're doing everything. And I said, what a great opportunity for these kids to come here and hang out at the SPCA while their parents are working. And she said, oh no, parents pay. This helps them, fiscally. It's a great plan. And these kids learn about animal care and they learn about animal comfort, and they themselves are comforted. And so someone asked the question, I don't remember, I think maybe it was you, April, about how do you sensitize people that might be afraid of pets? So in my early years, one of my friends said, never marry a man that doesn't like dogs. There's something wrong with them. But there are a lot of kids who haven't been exposed, and adults who haven't really been exposed to animals. And so how we're able to introduce people to an animal as a friend and as a protector is also very, very important. And that's a place where we see an abuse. Maybe they aren't abusing an animal, but they're using the threat of, I'm going to sick the dog on you, or or they get a big dog that scares everybody in the household. And that's another way of controlling. So, but I think that's an interesting class that we should offer through the rec center. Is how do you learn about taking care of pets, or through the SPCA's or other shelters,
or even wildlife. I mean, just knowing what to do for wildlife, not even just animals in your home, but as community members, we can do more.
That's right. I mean, we all kind of rely on the Lindsay Wildlife Museum to take pets that are, birds and that have been hurt or broken wings and things like that. But they have a limited capacity also.
For sure.
Well, thank you everyone for engaging in this dialogue, and thank you, Nancy.
Nancy, thank you so much.
I'll just remind everybody that you can connect with Mark or myself to learn more about the East Bay Animal PAC, to sign up on our mailing list, and to just engage with more of this type of activity with our civic leaders and elected officials. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nancy, thank you.